The RockJock's Sport Edition 4-inch lift kit for your Jeep JL Wrangler is everything you need to lift your Jeep and get some big tires put on it. The kit includes front lifted coil springs, urethane front spring isolators, front bump stops, adjustable Johnny joint front lower control arms, adjustable Johnny joint front track bar, adjustable Johnny joint rear lower control arms, front and rear adjustable sway bar links, rear lifted coil springs, and a rear bump stop kit. We'll start the lift installation by getting the vehicle safely in the air and removing the wheels and tires. First off, we'll remove the plastic chin panel with an 8mm socket and a small screwdriver for the plastic rivets. Support the front differential housing and lower the vehicle down to take the load off the suspension hardware. We'll steer the rotor out of the way so that we can gain access to the lower shock bolt for removal with an 18mm wrench and socket. Next, remove the upper shock bolt with an 18mm wrench and the shock will drop out. With a 15mm wrench, remove the brake line bracket from the lower control arm. Now we'll cycle the rotor back in the other direction to gain access to the sway bar bolt on the differential housing. Remove the bolt with an 18mm wrench and socket. Then remove the link from the bar with an 18mm wrench and a 6mm Allen wrench. Moving to the passenger side, repeat the process of removing the shock and brake line bracket from the control arm, followed by removing the sway bar link at the housing, and then from the sway bar. With a 21mm wrench and socket, remove the front track bar bolts from the housing, then using a 21mm wrench and socket again, remove the frame from the end of the track bar. Next, raise the vehicle up just high enough to remove the front coil springs and the plastic coil isolators from the housing. Back on the driver's side with a 21mm and 22mm wrench and socket, remove the lower control arm bolt at the frame and then at the housing. Next, drop out the arm from the vehicle. Remove the 10mm bolt that retains the brake hose bracket to the coil spring bucket on the differential housing. While you are there, remove the vent hose with a set of needle nose pliers. Measure your stock lower control arm and match this dimension onto the new adjustable Johnny joint control arm. Be mindful of driver and passenger side control arms. Zerk fittings go up and the brake bracket studs should all face outward. Install the new arm at the frame first and then at the housing. Go ahead and torque the arms down to spec. Back on the passenger side, depress the clip on the front differential wire and unplug it. Remove the 10mm bolt that retains the brake hose bracket to the coil spring bucket on the differential housing and free up the hose. Remove the lower control arm at the frame first and then at the housing. After adjusting the new lower arm to length, install it at the frame first, followed by at the differential. Then torque all hardware to spec. In preparation for the install of the front bump stops, center punch the middle of the top of the coil bucket, then drill out a small pilot hole, followed by stepping up to a 27 by 64th drill bit. Finish off the task by carefully tapping out the hole with a 1/2 inch by 13 NC tap. Go back and make sure your brake lines, vent hose, and differential wiring are free and loose so you can further raise the vehicle. With a 15mm wrench or socket, remove the front drive shaft from your differential yoke and zip tie it up and out of the way. Now raise the vehicle in preparation for installing new lifted coil springs. At this time, you will want to lay out your coil springs, spring isolators, and front bump stocks along with their hardware. Note that the part numbers on the coils determine either driver or passenger. The new RockJock urethane coil spring isolators will completely replace the stock plastic pieces. Start the installation by dropping the new spring isolators onto the coil spring buckets, being mindful that the pins on the isolators will align with the holes on the coil spring buckets. Pre-assemble your front bump stop hardware into the bump stops.
We'll start on the driver's side by making sure the factory rubber upper spring isolator is still in place and sliding the coil spring over the upper bump stop. At the bottom, insert the new bump stop inside the spring and install the bottom of the spring and the new bump stop as a unit onto the coil bucket of the differential housing. Tighten the bump stop using a 3/4 inch deep socket.
Repeat this installation on the passenger side. Ensure that the spring pigtail is indexed properly into the isolator. Now you may lower the vehicle back down onto its new lifted ride height. Still on the passenger side, reinstall the brake bracket onto the coil bucket and tighten the bolt down with a 10mm wrench. Then reinstall the brake line bracket to the lower control arm using the factory nut with a 15mm wrench. Depending on your choice of shocks, the amount of travel will cause the brake lines to be very taut. In our application, we bent the brake line brackets until they were flat to gain some slack in the brake lines. Next, find the differential wiring harness at the frame rail and clip the factory zip ties to allow more wire length to extend down. Reconnect the plug at the differential housing. On the driver's side, disconnect all vent hose mounting clips on the frame. This will allow you to pull the hose down so that the upper factory plastic push connector will now clip back into a new existing hole, giving the vent hose more slack. Don't forget to push the hose back into the metal retaining clip. Now you may reconnect the vent at the differential housing.
Insert the last black push connector into the hole in the brake line frame bracket.
Now clip the zip tie that is holding the drive shaft up and reconnect it to the differential yoke. Use blue Loctite on the hardware and torque the bolts back down to spec. Back on the driver's side, repeat the process of reinstalling the brake line bracket to the coil bucket on the differential housing, attaching the brake line bracket to the control arm and bending the brake line bracket as necessary. Various replacement shock options are available to work with the RockJock lift kit from reputable aftermarket companies such as Fox and King. Install the new shock reusing the factory hardware both top and bottom. Now you may repeat the shock installation process on the passenger side. Assemble your new sway bar links as shown by threading the jam nuts into the threaded rods, followed by threading the rods into the heim joints.
Install the driver's side sway bar link by simply inserting the heim joint stud back into the stock sway bar mounting hole and tighten the hardware using a 5/8 and 3/4 inch wrench. On the passenger side, install the top of the link into the sway bar, and then assemble the bottom of the link into the factory bracket using the 1/2 inch hardware and misalignment spacers provided in the kit.
Go back and tighten the top of the link of the sway bar with a 5/8 and 3/4 inch wrench. Then tighten the lower end of the link to the differential housing using two 3/4 inch wrenches.
Now go back and tighten all 4 sway bar link rods using a 3/4 inch wrench on the nut and a 19mm wrench on the heim joint.
Your finished installation should look something like this. The new 4130 chrome moly adjustable front track bar features Johnny joint rod ends on both ends.
Now you can install the front track bar at the frame using the factory hardware. Next, tighten and torque the hardware down to spec.
Leave the differential housing end of the front track bar loose for now. We'll address this issue when the vehicle is back on all 4 tires.
Moving on to the rear, we'll be installing new coil springs, bump stops, plus a set of Johnny Joint equipped lower control arms and a set of anti-rock style adjustable sway bar link rods which feature high quality Heim joints.
Support the rear differential housing and lower the vehicle down to take the load off the suspension hardware. Starting on the passenger side, with an 8mm socket, remove the inner splash aprons from the lower part of the back well of the wheel wells to allow easy access for the top of the shock hardware. With an 18mm wrench and socket, remove the lower shock bolt. Using the same 18mm socket, remove the upper shock bolt and then pull the shock down. Repeat the shock removal process on the driver's side. Back on the passenger side, using an 18mm wrench and socket, remove the lower end of the sway bar link from the differential housing.
Then, with an 18mm wrench and 6mm Allen wrench, remove the sway bar link nut and remove the link from the sway bar.
Still on the passenger side, with a 13mm wrench, remove the bolt that attaches the brake line bracket to the differential housing and pull it free. Disconnect the vent hose from the differential housing. On the driver's side, repeat the sway bar link and brake line bracket removal process. Back to the passenger side, using a 22mm wrench and a 21mm socket, remove the lower control arm from the housing first, followed by the one located at the frame. Measure your stock lower control arm and match this dimension to the new adjustable Johnny Joint control arm. Install the new RockJock control arm, starting with the frame end first, Zerk fittings pointing up. Now you may torque to spec. Now install the differential housing end of the arm and torque to spec. Repeat this arm installation process on the driver's side. Now you may lift the vehicle and remove the rear coil springs. The stock spring isolators are retained in the rear. The new RockJock rear coil springs have the part numbers listed to help you determine both left and right. You'll want to fit your factory rubber upper spring isolators onto the new springs and rotate them until the end of the spring pigtail finds the stop in the isolator. Also note the indexing pin on the isolator that aligns with the spring pocket of the frame.
Starting on the driver's side, when raising the new spring into the vehicle, again be mindful of aligning the indexing pin of the spring isolator into the hole of the frame. Then set the bottom of the spring down onto the stock isolator of the differential housing.
Repeat this coil spring installation on the passenger side. You may have to adjust the vehicle's height during the passenger side process to avoid the spring coming into contact with the back of the gas tank. Your finished coil spring installation should look something like this. Still on the passenger side, reinstall the brake line bracket to your differential housing. Repeat this process on the driver's side as well. Like at the front, depending on your choice of shocks, the amount of down travel may cause the brake lines to be very taut. In our application, we bent these brake line brackets upward to gain some slack in the brake lines. Before moving to the passenger side, go ahead and reconnect the vent hose. Repeat the same bump stop installation process from the passenger side onto the driver's side. Assemble your rear sway bar end links in the same fashion as the front links. In most cases, the hole in the sway bar will have to be drilled to accept the sway bar heim joint stud. You will have to drill this hole out to a 1/2 inch size. Note that the sway bar is made from hardened steel, so make sure that you lubricate your drill while using it. Install heim joint studs both top and bottom to the sway bar and to the differential tab using 5/8 and 3/4 inch wrench. Be mindful that the bottom of the link, you'll want to make sure that the brake line and ABS wires are clear and behind the back of the link. Repeat the same sway bar link installation process on the driver's side. Back on the passenger side, we'll install the new shock reusing the factory hardware both top and bottom. Reinstall the inner splash apron. Now you may repeat the shock and splash apron installation process on the driver's side. Your finished rear component installation should look like this. Take another look at your brake lines and bend the brackets as necessary to give your line some slack. Double check that you've torqued everything back down to spec. Be sure to snug up all 4 jam nuts on the new sway bar link rods by using a 3/4 inch wrench. Rotate the Johnny joints to center them in the brackets.
Use an 1 7/8 wrench or a large adjustable wrench to tighten down all of the jam nuts on the lower control arms.
Now go back and grease all of your Johnny joint Zerk fittings on the control arms, followed by the Zerk fitting found on the frame end of the track bar.
With the installation of this lift kit, we'll be installing new 37-inch Nitto tires on a set of KMC wheels. At this point, you may now lower the vehicle back down, install the wheels and tires, and torque the lug nuts.
Now that the vehicle is on the ground, we'll address the track bar. Start by measuring from a fixed point of the frame to a fixed point on the tire, and then repeat this process to the same points on the other side. The difference in these measurements will tell you how much you need to move the frame over the axle for proper track bar adjustment. There are various methods, but we've chosen to use a ratchet strap attached to the frame and to the differential housing to achieve our adjustment. Keep in mind that you may have to move your vehicle in the opposite direction of what we have illustrated here. Be sure to go back and confirm your dimensions from the frame to the tire on both sides. Once you have the frame centered between the tires, you can move on to attaching the track bar to the differential housing.
Adjust the front track bar as necessary so the bolt will line up and install freely through the housing. Reinstall the factory track bar bolt and nut plate and torque that to spec. You may now tighten the track bar jam nut using an 1.5" wrench and then release the ratchet strap. Reinstall the plastic chin panel under the front bumper, reusing its plastic rivets and 8mm head screws. And now let's hit the trail. As you can see, the Johnny Joint equipped suspension paired along with the anti-rock style adjustable link rods allows for more articulation in the suspension. It's this flex that allows all 4 wheels to maintain contact with the ground beneath the vehicle, which gives the driver more confidence to take on tougher obstacles than they would have with a stock vehicle. For more information, check us out at RockJock4x4.com, or you can see us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube.